Now, I might be a year late, but I just watched Attack on Titan, and it was phenomenal. The story of Eren Yeager is a modern-day treatise on the meaning of suffering, told within and through a beautiful and fragile world, one made tangible by a cast of characters that are fleshed out as real people. Now, I could talk all day about Attack on Titan, and I yet might, but today I want to focus on what I found to be a very challenging and difficult ending. It was so difficult, it took me a whole week to write this video. I mean, I kept slipping over the philosophical tripwires that are laid out by the fatalism that haunts the story and its characters. But finally, I think I do know what I want to say, and that's this. Attack on Titan might be the most depressing story I've ever consumed, but it also remains one of the most honest explorations of the human condition. It doesn't just ask us what it means to suffer. It asks us what it means to keep going in a world where suffering is inescapable, where we are all caught in a web of inevitable consequences. And for all of its tragedy, Attack on Titan offers us something crucial, a glimpse into the possibility of meaning in a world that seems determined to strip it away. So, as I dive into this analysis, I want to explore how Attack on Titan grapples with fatalism, determinism, and the search for freedom, and why, even in its darkest moments, it remains an optimistic diagnosis of the human condition. Fundamentally, Attack on Titan is a meditation on suffering. Suffering is the thread by which the story is woven. In the early seasons, this suffering takes the form of the terror of the Titans, who existentially threaten what we are told is the last of humanity. These Titans are senseless machinations of savagery. They kill not out of any hunger or any other biological need. They vomit their victims periodically, perpetuating meaningless death. In this way, the Titans personify suffering itself, wholly unknowable, untamable, and uncontrollable. But this dreadful suffering is, in the early seasons at least, it's balanced by the dignity and the humanity of our characters within the walls, who persist in their struggle against the Titan threat. And though it feels like the scouts are doomed to empty the sea of suffering with nothing but mere buckets, we find ourselves having faith in Irvin's gambles, in Levi's super skills, and most of all, in Eren's headstrong resolve. Together they defend Paradis, which we are led to believe stands like a lone flower blowing in a thunderstorm. Paradis, of course, alludes to an Eden, a Zion, a precious bastion of harmony, shielded from the senseless suffering of the outside world. And so, the early seasons feign an inspiring dichotomy between the fragile but precious order of humanity within the walls of Paradis, and the savage chaos of the Titans that linger just beyond. But slowly this facade between order and savagery crumbles away, just as Eren's childish assumptions about good and evil collapse in on themselves. First, we learn that the line between human and Titan is not absolute, as we are confronted with Annie's betrayal at the end of Season 1. And in Season 2 we learn that the breach of Shiganshina and the breach of trust was indeed the work of Reiner and Berthold. And later we learn that the three of them together murdered Marco. As all of this unfolds, we glimpse the seed of chaos that's taken root in Paradis. We witness the corruption of the Rice family and the ruling class. And we start making excuses for our characters when they are forced to shelve the Titan threat that they've fought so long and hard for, in order to face the more immediate danger of their own fellow man. And finally, we learn the truth about Paradis and Eldia. We learn that Titans, the existential threat to humanity, the manifestation of chaos and savagery, these have always just been human beings themselves, sent to march on Paradis by other humans, hateful and hurt. And so this inspiring duality of order and chaos that gives colour to the first season, it dissolves. The dignity of Paradis collapses as we learn that the source of this terrible suffering has always been within and between our own human condition. And this is why Titan shifters can only manifest their powers through self-harm. Whether Malian warrior or Eldian scout, the Titan shifters all fight, at least they think they do, to undo the suffering that consumes their world. And yet to combat this threat, they must take suffering upon themselves. It becomes a self-defeating mission. A young Armin reflects about the need to become a monster in order to fight monsters. But as the Attack on Titan story matures, this already tragic wisdom folds back in on itself as the only monsters out there are, and have always been, human. And so Armin ends up endorsing the very cycle of chaos and suffering that he fights so hard to combat. Ultimately, suffering isn't just a theme in Attack on Titan. It's a precondition for the very world our characters are born into. It's a part of the fabric of what it means to be. That is to say, suffering is not just a thing that happens in Attack on Titan. Rather, it's a determined pillar upon which the world hinges. But through Eren, the story revolts against itself. Eren rejects this metaphysical reality. He rejects suffering. Properly construed, Eren doesn't just fight to reduce or end suffering, but rather he fights to be free from the metaphysical laws of his world that weave suffering into the very air. If suffering holds up the world by its hairs, Eren wants to sever the knots. And so Attack on Titan offers us a new dichotomy, no longer one defined by a simplistic order and chaos, one far more nuanced. One between suffering as a metaphysical law and freedom from that law. But in the final analysis, what does Attack on Titan say about this conflict? Is freedom from suffering possible? Or is it just another illusion we are determined to suffer under some cosmic law? The answer, I think, is buried in the tangled threads of Eren's story. And I know just where to pull. I had a love-hate relationship with Eren for most of the story. He was just so punchable. But as is often the case with great characters, Eren's immaturity is entirely rewritten in the shadow of his ending. Eren is determined to free Paradis from the suffering that suffocates it. The moment he witnesses the smiling Titan consume his mother, his world assumes black and white distinctions. The world is one of suffering, and he will win humanity's freedom from it. And so Attack on Titan molds Eren as a champion of freedom, as a force of unyielding will. When Eren masters the sabotaged ODM gear, when he fights back a horde of Titans in Trost, when he takes down Annie, when he out-wrestles Reiner, defeats Bertholdt, Eren doesn't triumph through skill or wisdom or even luck. He wins these battles because he simply refuses to lose. His sheer untamable will enforces its agency upon the cruel world before him, indiscriminately. Through Eren, Attack on Titan offers an intoxicating promise. Suffering can be conquered, not through negotiation or reason, but through sheer, indomitable rage. Eren embodies this antidote to the world's endless cycle of pain, and for a time, Eren's promise holds. As he leads the charge to reclaim Shiganshina, all of Paradis rallies behind him. His defiance is no longer just his own, it becomes the spirit of an entire nation. But what Attack on Titan slowly, ruthlessly reveals is that rage is a double-edged sword. The more Eren fights to free the world from suffering, the more he tightens its grip. Episode by episode, the world begins tugging on Eren's strings. It confronts him with the truth that it was Reiner and Bertholdt, his own friends, who breached Shiganshina and condemned his mother to die. And this shatters his simplistic worldview. The Titans he swore to destroy were not only human, they were the very comrades that he had fought beside, eaten with, and laughed alongside for years. And how does Eren react? Denial. For all of his unrelenting rage against the Titans, for all of his unyielding will to be free of them, he gaslights himself and others. And then comes the coup against the monarchy. The government he fights to protect is rotten. The people he once thought of as his own would just as soon betray him. And by the time Eren learns the truth of the outside world, by the time he learns that the Titans were never the real enemy, that humanity has always been at war with itself, his once ironclad beliefs have already begun to fracture. And upon this confused, disillusioned child does Paradis hang its desperate hopes for freedom. But Eren doubles down. These revelations about Reiner and Bertholdt and the Eldian people, about Marley, they do not break him. They harden him. His rage, once aimed at the Titans, finds a new target, the world itself. To be free from suffering, he must transcend his old ideals about good and evil. And so Eren infiltrates the outside world. He slaughters the citizens of Liberio, women and children, just as indiscriminately as the Titans once slaughtered his own people. But the ends justify the means. Eren will have his freedom. But now we and the rest of Paradis, are confronted with Eren's war crimes. This once champion of the downtrodden has now become the executioner of the very people he was inspired to protect. And what's more, he makes Paradis and us as the viewer, he makes us complicit in these crimes. Because in our shared desire to escape suffering, we and all of Paradis, we bound ourselves to Eren's idealism. And now there's no turning back. The only way out is through, and like Armin and like Mikasa, we tell ourselves that Eren had no choice, that freedom from suffering demands the will to do what is necessary, even if it means sacrificing the innocent to save the many. And so as we journey back to Paradis and make peace with Sasha's senseless death, one truth weighs heavy on us all. We did this in the name of freedom. What would it mean then if that freedom were a lie? Eren's unrelenting resolve to be free naturally leads him to reclaiming the full power of the founding titan, with the objective of unleashing the rumbling to finally crush this world of suffering into submission. With the rumbling, Eren means to say one thing and one thing alone. To this cruel world woven with suffering, I do not bow to you. No one does. You are and will only ever be my instrument to shape and mold the world as I and humanity may desire it to be. We are free, and you are but a tool for us to wield at our whim. And in so doing, Eren will have finally freed Attack on Titan from that cosmic law from which its story hinges. With the rumbling, he declares, to be is not to suffer. To be is to wield suffering. A harsh but triumphant achievement for humanity, even if it is predicated on genocide. Except the world of suffering does not go gently into that good night. Eren stares into the abyss, declaring himself its master. But the abyss stares back. It's always been staring back. Reclaiming the founding titan allows Eren full access to his memories of the future, empowering him to glimpse the events yet to come. And further still, Eren learns to communicate with previous Attack Titan shifters and influences them to mold his plans across generations. At first, this gives Eren a great power, one which he is all too happy to manipulate in order to protect the freedom of the Eldian people. But Eren quickly realizes this ability has significant consequences, namely his ability to move about past and future. It removes any meaning of what it is to inhabit the present moment. And as a result, Eren is cut off from the flow of time. Moments become arbitrarily threaded together in a circle that he moves about and between. Past and future become muddled, first tangled, then indistinguishable. And here at last, Attack on Titan's world of suffering shows its winning hand. Cut off from any experience of the present, Eren becomes a spectator to his own story, trapped in a script he was always destined to follow. He begins to understand that his entire life, his father's life, the whole Titan story has been determined. And what's more, he becomes the instrument of that determination, as he observes himself moving about past and future, ensuring the certainty, the certain outcome of the cruel world he hates so much. And he is confronted with the dark truth that even those influences about past and future, he never freely chose to make them. He convinces his father Grisha to slaughter the Rice family, not because he chooses to, but because he's already seen himself doing it. He orchestrates his own inheritance of the Attack Titan, not because he wanted to, but because he knows that it's already happened. His desire for freedom, once so absolute, begins to unravel. He must wrestle with the reality that even his choice to interfere with the past seems woven into a fate that he cannot deviate from. And all of this culminates most tragically when Eren realizes that it was he himself who condemned his own mother to death, he himself who sent the Smiling Titan to devour her, he himself who was responsible for that very trauma that ignited the indomitable rage which gave Attack on Titan its whole story to begin with. This is the contradiction at the heart of Eren's character. He fights for freedom, but is shackled to a determined script of how that fight plays out. Every move he makes is informed by a vision of the future that he cannot change. If freedom is the ability to choose otherwise, then Eren has no freedom at all. He is a slave, not to Marley, not to the Titans, not even to the will of his enemies, but to the very concept he claims to cherish most. And there's a deeper tragedy here. Eren isn't acting out of hatred, nor even vengeance. At this point, he doesn't enjoy this. He doesn't revel in it. If anything, the closer he gets to his goal, the closer he gets to the rumbling, the more hollow he becomes. There's no fire in his eyes when he declares war on the world, no triumph in his voice when he unleashes the rumbling. Because by this point, Eren understands what we are only just beginning to see. Eren has not broken the cycle of suffering. He's become its engine. His war against suffering has turned him into the greatest instrument of suffering the world has ever seen. The boy who once swore to eradicate the Titans has become the thing he hated most, an unrelenting force of destruction, blind to the cries of the innocent. Eren, the boy who screamed at the world that he would be free, has not only become the most enslaved, but the very instrument of enslavement and suffering for everyone he sought to protect. And the Attack on Titan world puts us back in our place. We were only ever afforded a champion of freedom because the hope he gave us made us suffer all the more. We were only ever permitted to fight because our inevitable defeat was to make us suffer all the more. Suffering is all there is. It is threaded into the very air. It is the only thing available to us. And with it, all we can build is more suffering. And so the rumbling begins, never to be Eren's triumph, only his funeral march. And yet somehow it gets worse. Eren isn't the only one bound by his visions in the future. Think about this, if Eren foresees Mikasa strike him down, was she ever free to have done otherwise? If Eren foresees Hanji sacrificing herself to give the scouts a chance to board the plane, could she ever have chosen not to? If Eren sees Grisha claim the founding Titan, could he ever have walked away? And if they could not have done otherwise, does it follow that the whole of the Attack on Titan world is entirely determined, devoid of free will? And if their world has no free will, does that make Eren's mission for freedom and his entire character essentially meaningless? Well, for centuries, theologians have wrestled with a similar paradox, not for a Titan, but for God himself. The Abrahamic conception of God is one that is maximally great and perfect, who knows all things. The word we use to describe this is omniscience, literally meaning all-knowing. Now, if an omniscient God knows my future, and knows it infallibly so, is the future still mine to change? The problem is this: if an omniscient God exists, he will infallibly know what I will have for breakfast tomorrow. If this is the case, I am powerless to contradict that knowledge. If God foresees me eating bacon and eggs, then I must eat bacon and eggs, because if I were to choose otherwise, his knowledge would have been wrong. But an omniscient being cannot be wrong by a matter of definition, and therefore my choice is an illusion. I was never and could never have chosen to eat an omelette or any other food. And if I could never have chosen to act otherwise, in what way do I have free will? It would appear that God's omniscience necessitates a predetermined outcome, making an illusion of my freedom. Now this problem mirrors Eren's. Like the god of classical theology, Eren sees history not as unfolding, chapter by chapter, but as a completed whole, every moment equally real and fixed. And the result is that every choice of all of our characters, from Mikasa to Armin to King Fritz 2,000 years ago, all of it was set. A story already told from before it ever began. Every struggle, every sacrifice, every word. It was never going to go any other way. And that leaves us asking, what did it all mean? If the story of Attack on Titan never belonged to the characters who gave it shape and color, what did it mean? It's so easy to conclude from this that Attack on Titan dissolves into some type of nihilism. If even the struggle to defeat suffering was pre-written in a cruel fate doomed to fail, then was it all for nothing? If even the rage of our characters at the horror of their world is predetermined, was it ever even theirs? It begins to look like their struggle only ever existed to maximize the total suffering experienced. Ultimately, suffering blankets our characters and it strangles them of everything. It leaves them nothing, not the champion of freedom, now servant of suffering and slavery, not their sacrifices, not their defiance, not even their own rage. That intoxicating promise of Eren's character from season 1, that suffering could be conquered with indomitable spirit, only another illusion of suffering itself. Our characters become but specks of dust blowing in the wind of indifference, every word, every thought, but a meaningless echo dissolving into the air. And so the only real villain in Attack on Titan is Attack on Titan itself, and its victims are its characters. And so, well, where does that leave us? All great art asks us to wonder what it is to be, and Attack on Titan's answer is a bleak one. It shows us a fatalistic world empty of free will, where all it is to be is to suffer. But I don't think we're quite at the bottom of the rabbit hole just yet. There is more to be said here. So far, we've discussed the totality of suffering, wielding a deadly fatalism to suffocate any meaning to be found in the Attack on Titan world. But maybe we've been asking the wrong questions. We've been assuming that there is no meaning without choice. We've been assuming that meaning is measured by how we choose to live and what we choose to leave behind. And there's no room for that in the world of Attack on Titan. Yes, every choice, every struggle was already written. Yes, Eren's war for freedom was nothing but a preordained cycle of violence. His rage just another gear in the great turning wheel of history. But does that render it all meaningless? Or does it force us to look deeper at what meaning truly is? Even in a world where fate is fixed, where every action was always going to happen, our characters undeniably live. Armin still agonizes over what is right. Mikasa still loves. Hanji still burns with conviction. They still feel pain, grieve, they still dream. And those experiences, lived as deeply as they are, they're not erased by the fact that they were inevitable. If anything, perhaps their inevitability makes them all the more human. Because what Attack on Titan truly captures is not just suffering, but the endurance of consciousness in the face of it. It maps out what it is to be human in a universe that does not yield to us, where suffering is not something to be defeated, but something to bear with you along the walk of life. And in that, I think it tells us something profound, that meaning is not to be found in escaping suffering or in breaking free from fate, nothing so dramatic. Rather, it is forged in the infinitude of your own subjective experience. Meaning is the sum of your lived memories. It's the imprint left behind by your incalculable feelings on the indifferent universe that bore you. Determined or otherwise, your moments are still lived. The story of Attack on Titan may be pre-written from the start, but its characters still breathe within its story. And Eren's tragedy is not that he was bound by fate, but that he believed fate made his struggle meaningless. The characters of Attack on Titan live on, not because they've changed fate, but because they felt, because they struggled, because they were, and through them, Attack on Titan gently reminds us that even in a world without freedom, even in a world where we can't seem to find control, there's still something undeniable. That we were here, that we felt, that we lived. And if there is meaning in anything, it's in that. So perhaps Attack on Titan is not so much a nihilistic story as it is an honest one. It doesn't offer any easy answers. It doesn't promise that we can overcome suffering. Nothing so naive. But it shows us that even in a world devoid of free will, one even that's uniform in suffering, our experiences, our love and our pain, they still matter. They shape the landscape of existence. They are what it means to be. Perhaps that is what Attack on Titan leaves us with. The idea that meaning is not to be found in rewriting fate, but in living it. That we are each walking paths already paved, but the steps we take upon them will always belong to us. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. There's more to say, especially about Ymir and Mikasa and the whole rebirth of the Titan tree, but I think that's enough for now. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. It does mean a great deal. And as always, my friends, have a very good day.